The British didn't just colonize India. They hollowed it out, sold the skeleton, and charged Indians for the funeral. This is the story of how an empire killed a booming economy. In 1757, India was one of the richest economies on the planet, a global hub for textiles, metalwork, and trade. By 1947, it was one of the poorest, broken by centuries of colonial rule. But this wasn't just about foreign flags or lost battles. It was about money. The British didn't just rule India, they extracted it. They turned farmers into exporters of famine, replaced thriving industries with British imports, and then used India's own wealth to pay for their wars, pensions, and luxury in London. When India finally became free, it didn't inherit an economy. It inherited a disaster. Historical context. The Indian economy on the eve of independence, roughly between the late 1930s and early 1940s, was marked by deep stagnation and underdevelopment, largely a consequence of nearly 2 centuries of British colonial rule. The British occupation of India formally began in 1757 after the Battle of Plassey, when the British East India Company established control over Bengal. This foothold gradually expanded until the British Crown assumed direct control in 1858, following the Revolt of 1857. Prior to British rule, India had a thriving economy, often referred to as one of the richest regions in the world. It was self-sufficient in food production, and its textile, metalwork, shipbuilding, and handicrafts industries were globally renowned. Indian merchants traded extensively across Asia, the Middle East, and even Europe. The agricultural sector, though largely feudal, supported a substantial rural economy, and various regions had developed systems of irrigation, trade guilds, and localized banking. However, under British colonial policies, India was systematically deindustrialized and turned into a supplier of raw materials for British industries. Indigenous manufacturing, particularly the textile industry, declined drastically due to unfair trade practices and import policies favoring British goods. Infrastructure like railways and telegraphs, although modern, was developed primarily to serve colonial interests rather than domestic needs. Moreover, no sincere efforts were made to assess India's national or per capita income during this period, reflecting the colonial administration's disregard for the country's economic well-being. Low level of economic development. Extensive research indicates that the Indian economy remained largely stagnant under British colonial rule. In the first half of the 20th century, the aggregate real output growth is estimated to have remained below 2% annually, while per capita income grew at an alarmingly low rate of merely 0.5% per year. These figures reflect the overall economic stagnation and failure to translate even modest gains into improved living standards for the majority of Indians. One major obstacle in assessing India's economic condition during the colonial era was the absence of systematic and official efforts to calculate national income. In the absence of such data, early Indian economists took on the task of estimating the country's economic performance. Pioneering figures such as Dadabhai Naoroji, William Digby, Finlay Shiras, R.C. Desai, and V.K.R.V. Rao provided crucial insights into the Indian economy. Among them, V.K.R.V. Rao's estimates are especially valuable, as they are based on more rigorous methodologies and offer a detailed picture of national income trends in colonial India. Dadabhai Naoroji, one of the earliest critics of British economic policies, developed the influential drain of wealth theory, arguing that colonialism extracted substantial economic surplus from India and transferred it to Britain without any adequate return. His calculations, although based on limited data, laid the foundation for economic nationalism and helped to quantify the extent of British exploitation. V.K.R.V. Rao's estimates further confirm these concerns by demonstrating how income levels remained stagnant over decades, supporting the conclusion that British rule contributed little to economic progress. Rather than promoting development, colonial policies prioritized the extraction of raw materials, revenue generation, and the protection of British commercial interests, leaving Indian agriculture under strain and industry in decline. Agricultural sector. Agriculture formed the backbone of the Indian economy in the decades leading up to independence, with approximately 85% of the population residing in rural areas and directly dependent on farming for their livelihood. Despite its central role, the sector suffered from deep structural and institutional weaknesses that hindered productivity and rural prosperity. One of the most damaging systems was the zamindari land tenure arrangement introduced by the British, particularly after the permanent settlement of 1793 in Bengal. Under this system, land revenue was collected from landlords, zamindars, who had little incentive to invest in the land or improve agricultural practices. Cultivators, often sharecroppers or tenants, had insecure land rights and retained only a small fraction of the produce, discouraging any long-term improvements. Colonial agricultural policies prioritized the cultivation of cash crops such as cotton, indigo, tea, jute, and opium, primarily for export to fuel British industries. This emphasis came at the expense of food grains, disrupting local food supply chains and increasing India's vulnerability to famines. Notable examples include the Great Bengal Famine of 1943, in which an estimated 3 million people perished due to a combination of wartime hoarding, export-focused production, and poor colonial response. Technological advancement in agriculture remained negligible. Most farmers used wooden plows, relied on bullocks for draft power, and had limited or no access to modern inputs like chemical fertilizers, pesticides, or high-yield seeds. Agricultural productivity, measured in terms of output per hectare, remained among the lowest in the world. Irrigation development saw some growth under the British, particularly with the construction of canal systems in the Punjab and parts of the Madras Presidency. However, these efforts were often driven by revenue concerns and military logistics rather than rural development. Investment in other critical infrastructure, such as terracing, drainage, flood control, and desalination, remained minimal, making vast tracts of land vulnerable to monsoon failure, salinity, and waterlogging. As a result, Indian agriculture at the eve of independence was marked by chronic underinvestment, environmental vulnerability, low productivity, and widespread rural poverty. The sector's stagnation not only depressed rural incomes, but also constrained broader economic development, since a majority of the population remained trapped in subsistence-level farming. Industrial sector. At the eve of independence, India's industrial sector remained severely underdeveloped, largely as a result of British colonial policies designed to benefit Britain rather than foster indigenous industrial growth. Prior to British domination, India had a rich tradition of skilled manufacturing in cotton and silk textiles, metalwork, ivory carving, and precious stone crafting. Indian handicrafts were globally admired and widely exported through established trade networks reaching Central Asia, Europe, and Southeast Asia. However, with the advent of British rule and the Industrial Revolution in Britain, Indian artisans were gradually displaced. The introduction of British machine-made goods, protected by favorable tariff policies, led to the rapid decline of Indian cottage industries. British imports flooded Indian markets, while high duties and discriminatory trade practices made it nearly impossible for Indian products to compete abroad. By the mid-19th century, entire artisan communities faced mass unemployment, leading to deindustrialization and widespread rural migration. Modern industrial development began slowly in the second half of the 19th century. The first cotton textile mills were established in Bombay, now Mumbai, and Ahmedabad during the 1850s and 1860s. Similarly, the jute industry took root in Bengal, with jute mills in Risra near Calcutta, now Kolkata, catering primarily to the export market, particularly to British shipping and packaging industries. A significant milestone was the founding of the Tata Iron and Steel Company, TISCO, in Jamshedpur in 1907. They became India's first major steel producer. Despite such developments, the overall pace of industrialization remained sluggish. Key sectors such as sugar, cement, paper, and glass emerged only in the early decades of the 20th century, with most growth occurring during and after the Second World War, when wartime disruptions to British supply chains temporarily created space for local industry. Nonetheless, India lacked a capital goods industry. The industrial base needed to produce machinery, tools, and heavy equipment, limiting the possibility of self-sustained industrial growth. Public sector participation remained restricted to areas critical for British control, such as railways, telegraphs, ports, and electricity. Even these services were developed primarily to extract resources and facilitate administrative control, rather than stimulate domestic industrialization. The contribution of modern industry to India's gross domestic product remained small throughout the colonial period, with average growth rates hovering below 2% annually. India was effectively reduced to an exporter of raw materials such as cotton, jute, tea, and iron ore, while becoming a dumping ground for British manufactured goods. The industrial sector, therefore, entered independence with a narrow base, inadequate infrastructure, and minimal investment in technological capacity or industrial education. Foreign trade. India's foreign trade during the colonial period was deliberately structured to serve British economic and strategic interests. The trade pattern was highly asymmetrical. India exported primary products such as raw cotton, jute, wool, sugar, indigo, opium, and raw silk, while importing finished goods, primarily manufactured textiles and light industrial machinery, mainly from Britain. This pattern reflected the classic colonial model in which the colony supplied raw materials and served as a captive market for the imperial power's industrial output. More than half of India's total trade during the late 19th and early 20th centuries was conducted with Britain alone. The remainder was largely limited to countries under British influence or trading networks, including China, Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, Burma, now Myanmar, and Persia, now Iran. The trade policy enforced by the British systematically discouraged the development of Indian industry and maintained India in a dependent economic position. Although India often generated a large export surplus, meaning exports exceeded imports, this surplus did not translate into domestic economic gain. Instead, it was used to meet Britain's home charges, a term that included a wide range of colonial expenses such as pensions for British officers, interest payments on loans raised in Britain, expenditures on the India office in London, and costs related to Britain's imperial military campaigns. These so-called invisible imports represented a significant outflow of wealth from India without any tangible return. This phenomenon contributed to what Indian nationalists, notably Dadabhai Naoroji, described as the drain of wealth, a central argument in the economic critique of colonialism. The export surplus masked a deeper impoverishment, as the earnings were not reinvested in India's development, but rather financed the British Empire's global operations. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 further tightened British control over Indian trade by reducing travel time between Europe and South Asia. This gave Britain an even greater logistical and commercial advantage, solidifying its dominance over Indian ports and maritime routes. However, the increased extraction of raw materials and the influx of British goods led to growing shortages of essential commodities such as food grains, clothing, and kerosene in the domestic market. These shortages frequently drove up prices and contributed to the broader economic hardship faced by the Indian population, particularly during times of famine and war. Demographic conditions. Systematic demographic data collection in India began with the first synchronous census conducted in 1881. From that point onward, censuses were held every 10 years, offering crucial insights into the size, composition, and structure of India's population under colonial rule. However, early censuses were often limited in accuracy due to the vast rural landscape, lack of administrative infrastructure, and inconsistencies in data collection methods. Up until the year 1921, India remained in the first stage of the demographic transition model, characterized by both high birth rates and high death rates. This pattern resulted in stagnant population growth, punctuated by frequent famines, epidemics such as cholera, plague, and influenza, and poor public health infrastructure. The census of 1921 is historically known as the Year of the Great Divide, after which the population began to grow more steadily. This shift marked the beginning of the second stage of demographic transition, with the death rate starting to decline, though the birth rate remained high. Literacy levels were extremely low. At the time of independence, overall literacy stood at less than 16% of the population. The disparity between genders was particularly stark. Only around 7% of women were literate, reflecting deep-rooted social barriers to female education and the absence of large-scale educational infrastructure. Access to formal schooling was limited mostly to urban elites, with rural populations, women, and marginalized communities largely excluded from educational opportunities. Healthcare facilities during the colonial period were grossly inadequate. The British administration focused primarily on the health of the colonial bureaucracy, army personnel, and urban elites, while the vast majority of the rural population had minimal access to medical care. High mortality rates were the norm. Infant mortality was alarmingly high, around 218 deaths per 1,000 live births, primarily due to malnutrition, lack of vaccination, unsanitary conditions, and untreated infectious diseases. Life expectancy hovered at a mere 32 years, highlighting the severe state of public health. For comparison, modern India's infant mortality rate has dropped to around 28 per 1,000 live births, and life expectancy has risen to approximately 69 years. Widespread poverty compounded these demographic challenges. Poor nutrition, high disease burden, and limited access to clean water and sanitation all contributed to a vulnerable and struggling population. The demographic profile at independence reflected a society grappling with the cumulative effects of centuries of neglect in health, education, and human development, issues that would pose serious challenges for post-independence nation building. Infrastructure development in colonial India was shaped almost entirely by British strategic and economic interests rather than by any intention to foster national development. The most visible example was the railway network, introduced in the early 1850s. The first railway line was inaugurated in 1853, running from Bombay, now Mumbai, to Thane over a distance of 34 kilometers. While the railways eventually became one of the largest networks in the world, their primary purpose was to facilitate the movement of raw materials from the interior to ports for export, enable rapid military mobilization, and ensure administrative control over the vast territory. The commercialization of agriculture, especially in cash crops like cotton, jute, and indigo, was closely tied to railway expansion. However, the benefits of this infrastructure rarely reached ordinary Indians. Rail fares and freight rates were designed to favor British trade, and Indian capital played little role in railway ownership or management. Indian passengers, often packed into overcrowded third-class compartments, received little of the convenience or economic mobility that railways could have provided under a development-oriented model. Road infrastructure remained underdeveloped and neglected. While some roads were built to support army movements and connect plantations or mines to ports, there was a critical shortage of all-weather roads, especially in rural areas. This deficiency became starkly evident during famines, when food could not be transported efficiently to affected regions, exacerbating death tolls. Most rural roads were simple dirt tracks, unusable during monsoon months, further isolating villages and hindering rural economic integration. Inland waterways, once a traditional mode of transport in many parts of India, declined during British rule. Projects like the Coast Canal in Orissa, although initially promising, proved uneconomical and were ultimately abandoned. Inland navigation was not systematically developed, in part because it competed with the railways, which were favored for investment due to their profitability and strategic utility. The electric telegraph, introduced in India in the 1850s, was another example of infrastructure designed for colonial control. It allowed British administrators to maintain communication across provinces and coordinate responses to rebellions or natural disasters, but it remained inaccessible to most Indians. Similarly, the postal system, while gradually expanded during the colonial period, was inadequate for the needs of a largely illiterate rural population. Many villages lacked even basic postal access, and service quality was poor. In essence, the infrastructure built under colonial rule was not aimed at integrating or modernizing the Indian economy. Rather, it served as a tool for exploitation, ensuring the smooth extraction of resources and the efficient functioning of British administrative machinery. As a result, when India achieved independence in 1947, it inherited an infrastructure network that was patchy, unevenly distributed, and poorly aligned with the needs of national development. Conclusion. In conclusion, the Indian economy on the eve of independence in 1947 was shaped by nearly 2 centuries of colonial exploitation, resulting in stagnation, minimal industrial growth, and widespread poverty. Agriculture remained backward due to systems like zamindari and a focus on export crops, while indigenous industries had been systematically dismantled. Despite having one of the world's largest railway networks, infrastructure mainly served British interests. Foreign trade generated export surpluses that funded British expenses abroad, contributing to the drain of wealth. Demographic indicators, such as life expectancy of just over 30 years and literacy below 16%, reflected poor human development. This legacy of underdevelopment set the stage for the monumental task of economic reconstruction in post-independence India.